Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about a closer look at the Global South. How concerned should we be about the events that are taking place in the Global South? Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Always good to talk about the globally connected Global South, I suppose. I think it's an interesting topic that sometimes we sort of lose sight of.
I agree. And one of the questions that we really should address is just how connected is the Global South? It has a huge number of people. It has huge, valuable resources, and it must be increasingly important going forward, especially in these difficult times. We should study what's going on in the Global South so we can determine appropriate foreign and economic policy to deal with the way it is now and the way it will be. So can you help us with the definition? What is the Global South, Carl? And why do we call it that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question because the Global South has gained a lot of resonance in recent years, but actually it's been around. It's attributed to a political activist named Carl Oglesby from 1969. So it actually goes all the way back to the Vietnam War era, and what was happening in the late 60s, as you may recall, was we were really looking at what happens as we move away from colonization, and the Global South was really that group of nations that had been dominated by the so-called Global North, and through political and economic exploitation during the colonial era. And so the Global South has always been a bit amorphous. I mean, if you look back then, what we were talking about is the third world, which made sense in the context of the West being the first world and the communist Warsaw Pact being the second world, and then the third world were all the others. So it was really sort of a residual category, and then China, the economists sort of jumped in and said, well, it's really the less developed world. So then we talked about the less developed countries, the LDCs, for a while, and then, in 1965, there was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia and the Group of 77, which soon became called the non-aligned movement, and that sort of represented this thing that we nowadays call the Global South. And this North-South divide really comes from, if you remember the old German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who talked about the North-South divide in the context of that era of colonialism, where there were these countries that were very poor, very, very marginal to the global economy. And of course China was part of that in the 60s. After the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward in China, China was one of the big countries in that non-aligned movement and in that so-called Global South. And India was there, Indonesia, big countries in South America were there, Africa was there, so that's what we have today. And that's really who the Global South is. But of course, the Global South in some ways is shrinking because in the late 60s, clearly all of Southeast Asia was considered part of that. That's not so true anymore. You've got places like Singapore, and you've got places like Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, really developing countries, and they've become much more entwined into the global economy. Yet they still identify with that broad category called the Global South, where really the heart of the Global South today, I think, is in Africa, where there's really very little evidence of deep connection with the global economic order, and it's largely economic. I mean, there's a political element to it, but it's largely an economic element. And what I think is happening today is that China is very much playing to that Global South audience as the emerging leader in the context of a diminishing America, diminishing United States, a diminishing West. And I think that's why the Global South has taken on new relevance in today's world, because it's becoming very much an object of the competition between China and the United States. Not so much the United States recognizing it, especially given what we've done with foreign aid in the last year or so. And China, meanwhile, through its Belt and Road Initiative, through its digital connectivity, through its assistance that it's provided, is clearly trying to move into that space to show that it is really becoming the go-to country for these countries to look to assistance and movement into a more connected world.
Why is China interested? Is it the natural resources? Is it strategic location? Why does China care about these countries?
Well, sure, it's about the resources, but it's also about the recognition that if you are capable of dominating these countries, you're much better positioned to make the rules that govern the global order. And I think this is China's long-term aim, is to become much more active in that area and to become much more influential in the way the global order is structured and the economy is geared toward benefiting the Chinese economy. Some of it certainly is trying to move excess offshore from China, but it's also a matter of China recognizing that there's a leadership role to be had in the absence of a strong commitment by uh, the West, specifically the United States in this case, to continue to provide economic support to these lesser developed countries or the global South, however we want to characterize them. They're certainly on the periphery of the capitalist economy. And so I think that that's why China is really interested in that area, because it sees it as a resource that it can use in its attempt to become more influential in the world.
When I think of the global South, and I'm making a wild guess here, I am thinking of Africa. I'm thinking of Eastern Africa, below the Sahel. I'm thinking of countries like Sudan, which have perpetual war, perpetual famine, perpetual, poverty, and of course disease. That's what I'm thinking of. And I expect there's a lot of countries like that. And I guess the question is, do those countries have anything in common aside from those coincidental characteristics? For example, are they all former colonies? Is colonialization a part of defining the global South?
Yeah, sure it is. That's part of the definition. That's where the definition comes from, is that it is the collection of countries that were dominated. Now, that's not to say that it's exclusive. That's not a mandatory criteria to be included in that group of countries. Again, it's always been a residual category. Even whatever term we use, it's always been that residual category of countries that aren't at the core of the capitalist system. They've been the beneficiaries of economic assistance. They've been poor. They've been left out of capitalist growth. And I can't really say that there's that there's a defining characteristic. It has to be a former colony, or it has to be in Africa, because there's pockets throughout the world that are really part of the global South.
And well, let's talk about those pockets. I would have guessed that Africa has its more than a fair share.
Yeah,
I would have guessed that Southeast Asia has some. I would have guessed Latin America has some, even though
I
there are
agree.
some prosperous countries there.
Yeah, it
Um,
does. Yeah, it does.
and in other words, we're looking for countries in the southern part of the hemispheres. We're looking for countries that have not done particularly well. We're looking for countries that are exposed to people who want other countries, North countries, the global North countries that want to dominate, just as they always have. It's just that dominance changes these days, and it's not that dominance isn't what it used to be. You can quote me on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, I think the unfortunate word here is the word South because it suggests that there's some geographic relevance, and there really isn't. I mean, there's pockets of the global South all over, and it can be in the north. I mean, I would say that there's probably parts of rural Russia that are part of the global South. It's almost an identity rather than a category, an objective category of countries. It's more of an identity because China still, at times considers itself part of the global South, and that goes back to their days of the non-aligned movement. India, even though it's rapidly developing, considers itself part of this global South, and it's really an identity issue for them. Again, based on how we've arrived at this terminology. The non-aligned movement includes several countries, and in even even as we expanded the G7 to the G20 during the financial crisis, we included some of the countries that were traditionally considered part of the global South, Brazil and Indonesia, were included in the G20 because we saw them moving toward the more uh, center of the capitalist system. But the fact is that these many people in these countries, including the governments, still consider themselves part of this global South. So I don't think it's useful to get too wrapped around the axle on how you define this group geographically. It's really more of an identity, and
Mm.
in the for the United States, it's the rest of the country that people have used rather derogatory terms to describe at times.
You mean Trump?
I do, but I mean that's a fact of life for some of those people. And let's take Lesotho as sort of the obvious example. Is yes, we have a trade imbalance with Lesotho because Lesotho can't afford to buy American goods, and they probably never will be able to buy American goods. So so I think that's sort of the misunderstanding of what that global South represents. These are poor countries, and these are populations that live in grinding poverty. And if you've never had the opportunity to walk around some of the slums in Asia or some of the slums in South America, then you don't appreciate what grinding poverty really is.
Maybe it's a misnomer. If you were going to look now for a better word to define what we have been referring to as the global South, what would you say? I know this is an unfair question, but um, can you
Well,
come up with a word that fits?
yeah, I mean, I'm a follower of Emmanuel Wallerstein's world systems, and so so if from a purely capitalist perspective, they're very much a periphery countries where the core of capitalism still resides in the West, and the rest of the world is more peripheral to that central mechanism of the capitalist system. So I think that the peripheral countries are probably better suited when you look at it from a purely world capitalist standpoint. But politically it becomes more complicated. There, I think the group of 77, which is what we used to call the non-aligned movement, is probably a fair characterization politically that the people that identify as that non-aligned group trying to take advantage of competition between the capitalist countries, and that group of capitalist countries has obviously changed a bit as China has moved into that core. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they've become much more part of that capitalist core that these countries now look to for economic assistance and economic benefit for deployment of capital into those countries.
Yeah, well, I think you've touched on a number of points that evoke my curiosity. One of them is part of the definition here is they don't have any money, and that leads to all kinds of other things. It's hard to find a country that has no money, which at the same time is a robust democracy. Having no money leads to autocracy or worse. And I suggest to you, see if you agree with me, that if that's what the global South is, they have no money, then we can make some rough conclusions that they don't have any democracy either. Do you agree?
For the most part, I think that's right. I mean, there certainly are exceptions to the rule, but I think you're right. I think a lack of capital because they have resources, but their resources tend to be exploited by outsiders. The other part, when you look at the political side of these countries, beyond the economic side, the political side is they tend to lack agency or lack they have a lack of agency in the global system, in the global uh, political system. So they're part of the UN, but they really have no agency in the UN. They simply are recipients of whatever the Security Council or the more powerful countries have in the global order, in global political order.
Well, that's another thing that strikes me from what you've said so far is that they are effectively the victims of those who would dominate them. But more than that, they are needy, and they come asking for help.
Mhm.
You could also say that since they have no money, that they're perpetually asking for aid. And this takes us to, USAID. It takes us to global trade, which are all important topics these days. And one thing you mentioned that I want to inquire about. So the United Nations after World War II was dedicated to try to create a kind of equalization, I think, so that nobody was way up on the top and nobody was way at the bottom. And it doesn't sound like the United Nations has succeeded. And as a matter of fact, they have made efforts to, the United Nations has made efforts to provide aid for these countries, but we still have an enormous number of countries that are the victims of the global economic order, which does not favor them. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Did the United Nations miss the boat on this?
Well, I mean, I'm reluctant to say that the United Nations missed the boat. I mean, the fact is you have a Security Council that is made up of 5 permanent members, and so I don't know that we were really the real goal of the United Nations was to equalize countries, to democratize the world, if you. I think there was always the clear intent of the powerful to maintain their power in the system, and certainly there was I think to your real point here is that there was an attempt to integrate them into the global system, but not to really make them equal partners in the global system. There was always this dominance by the permanent five to ensure that they maintain real power in the global system.
Well, let me shift a little bit. I don't know the answer, but I would ask you: Was there a time when the United States saw itself with USAID and other aid programs as the protector of the global South? We care about you. We're going to come and help you. We're going to get rid of bad government, which is sometimes a really bad idea. We're going to help you economically in terms of trade and expertise and business, what have you.
Mhm.
Did the United States see itself as the protector of the global South at any point, and why?
Again, this goes with the evolution of where we came after World War II. Of course, the United States saw itself as the protector of the global order. I mean, more broadly, well beyond just the global South. It saw itself as a protector of the global order in a much broader sense. But certainly, I mean, this was the intent of USAID. This was the intent of promoting democracy in the global South or in the rest of the world. And certainly we failed in some ways. In during the Cold War, when we were really competing with Russia for client states, if you will, there was very much this effort to recruit people in the global South or in the third world, what we used at the time, the term we used at the time, to support U.S. interests, and we used those countries to push our way through the United Nations to get resolutions in the United Nations passed, and we would try to find people who could serve on the temporary seats on the Security Council to make sure that we would always have a favorable uh, setting for promoting U.S. interests. So yeah, the United States certainly used to see itself as that. In fact, I would say up until um, very recently, we saw ourselves as the protector. That's why all the noise and commotion in the American media these days about cutting off medicine, cutting off you know basic food supplies to several parts of the world.
No, we seem to have given that up. I mean, but I love this conversation, Carl. I really do, because it's filling in gaps for me. So this didn't happen overnight. The failure of interest, the United States interest in USAID, did not happen, since the inauguration. It was happening over a period of time. We cared less about them. We did less for them. We did some things, health benefits and food and that sort of thing, but we didn't put boots on the ground very much, and we were unsuccessful in delivering democracy, if you will, or even peace. And
Yeah.
so, I guess my question is, why did we back away from that? Was that a domestic political issue, or we just like forgot where we were going?
It's very difficult. It proved to be very difficult. And and American foreign policy over the years has had different approaches to what it was really trying to do in the global South, if you will. At one point we very much were promoting democracy, and if you didn't have democracy promotion in your community, then you didn't receive it. Uh, so that's one side. That there was competing interests. It wasn't just purely economic assistance and development assistance. There was always this caveat of, well, you need to have democracy to go along with that aid. Otherwise, we're going to restrict the aid. So there we developed this notion over the span of decades where our aid became conditional, and it wasn't just a handout. We weren't going to just give them fish. We were going to teach them to fish. And so there was very much per, this sort of paternal approach to the rest of the world, that we know what's better for you, and you follow our model, and then you will be successful, and we'll give you aid. So that was some of the deterioration. And the other deterioration, is the fact that USAID specifically, and aid in general, US aid in general, had very much become a opportunity for corruption through local contract. That very little of the work being done by USAID was being done by people who had some sense of mission of helping the rest of the world. It became a network of contractors and local contractors who were certainly uh, susceptible to bribes and take kickbacks and all that. So there was a fair bit of corruption, I'm sure, that you could find in some of the local administrations, some of the local administration of U.S. aid in different parts of the world, because it adapted to local conditions. And as you said, local conditions tended not to be very democratic, and certainly there was a lack of good governance in those areas where that aid was being distributed.
Let's talk for a minute about John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps.
Mhm.
When I got out of school, a number of my friends went into the Peace Corps, and I lost touch with them because they were, in the jungles and so forth. But I admired them very greatly for doing that, and well, I guess I know one or two of them today too. They were, sort of the example of the American person who cared about the world.
Mhm. Yeah.
And Kennedy cared for that. I mean, he didn't do it just for love. He had a noble purpose in mind, for sure. But the Peace Corps went away, and I remember how it sort of transmuted itself to Vista, the domestic Peace Corps, and all that. But we don't have a Peace Corps anymore to speak of, I think. And the
Well,
question
there's
is,
there's
why
still
not?
there's still the basic elements, but it certainly isn't what it was, as you say, in the 60s and 70s. And some of this was, sort of I mean, the Vietnam War certainly didn't help the image of the Americans in the Peace Corps, and uh, certainly I think some of the programs were not really all that well suited to promoting American interests, and so yeah, the Peace Corps slowly atrophied along with the commitment that you saw from the United States in the 50s and 60s to really build a strong sense of community. But I think, again, this goes back to what I was saying. I think that the original vision of American foreign policy in providing foreign assistance was community building. That was really the focus. And the economic assistance was always somewhat lacking because we didn't think it was right to give people things. We had to teach them things rather than just hand out free assistance.
A few years ago, who was trying to establish a steel mill in Congo, and he had put a corner on all the steel, the used steel, because used steel is better. It's cheaper and it's available, where new steel in Congo is hard to get. And of course, there was a certain amount of corruption going on in Congo. I guess that's
Mm.
part of the global South. And he thought he had it worked out. He thought he was going to open on Monday and be rolling steel. However, the government, such as it was, that is the Congo government, stopped him cold as a matter of corruption. And it was over. He turned his back and he left Congo, never touched it again.
Mm.
He'd lost a lot of money. And I'm saying, where was the US involved in all of this? The same kind of issue took place during the Biden administration, where the Chinese bought cobalt mines in Central Africa. And cobalt is very important for technology and cell phones and all that. They bought the mines from a failing American company that couldn't maintain their you know their company, and and Biden stepped in and did something to encourage some other American company to somehow get it back from the Chinese. So what I'm really circling around here is the notion that the government, the United States government, really needs to or has needed to encourage business people, entrepreneurs, to do moral, non-corrupt business development in the global South and succeed at it. Have they done that?
Well, they've tried. I mean, we've always had, the Export Import Bank. We've had, I mean, and in fact, we did reform our development assistance, where we now have the Development Finance Corporation, which was supposed to solve all the problems you talk about. It really hasn't, because you still haven't been able to get private capital investing in these countries for a whole variety of reasons. One of them is corruption. The other one is profitability. Development Finance Corporation was intended to fix some of the problems that we've talked about corruption and about local inability to make money on local projects. And it hasn't really been successful because we still haven't been able to bring private capital to bear on some of the economic assistance programs that the country has. And some of this is natural because we don't have state-owned enterprises that can absorb those losses, and the private companies don't want to take the risk of building in a country where they know there's corruption, where it's going to be a long-term prospect before they actually turn a profit on those businesses. And this is where, of course, China has been more successful in infrastructure development. Japan has always been more successful in that area also because they're willing to put government money into infrastructure development. And the United States has always been reluctant to do that. Europe has had the same struggle in Africa, where they've had private companies go into Africa, lose money, give up, go home, because they don't really have a mechanism in the government like the United States doesn't, to be able to sustain an investment to see it through to profitability.
Oh, we're really touching on some important solutions here. One thing is that over the my observation over the past, say, 25 years, China has perfected its Belt Road debt trap system, and it has built, infrastructure and taken loans, given loans on various third world countries who want to have infrastructure. Ports and harbors come to mind. Sri Lanka comes to mind, and the United States hasn't done that. We haven't gone in there and built ports and harbors. We haven't gone in and put the money down or arranged the money for these infrastructure projects that would raise up a global South country to be much more prosperous and more directly involved in world trade and all. Um, China has done that more and more and more and more. Now you can criticize the debt trap system they have, and it is pernicious.
I'll disagree a little bit with that. I mean, that
Okay.
whole idea of a debt trap is really sort of a creation of American information dissemination, let's call it. It turns out that some of those accusations about debt trap diplomacy was really sort of an inaccurate characterization of what was happening. That yes, certainly China has been at fault in creating some of those situations where they were building infrastructure that was never going to be profitable, and they certainly did create a situation where they were demanding loan repayments that were inconsistent with what the World Bank and other global financial organizations had allowed to exist with Western financing. I accept that, but it also was a little bit excessive in how we were characterizing everything happening in Belt and Road as debt trap diplomacy. So I just throw that on.
I'm not disagreeing with that. My point, and maybe my question is, why haven't we done that? And when I say that, I mean provide funding, however the model, provide funding for the development of infrastructure in these global South countries. It
Well,
seems like it's an obvious benefit for everyone involved, really. However you characterize it, we haven't done it.
Well, the United States, it's tried, and I think this was probably early Biden administration. There was an agreement between Japan, the United States, and Australia to do trilateral cooperation, and it was largely in response to the successes that they saw with China's Belt and Road. As I said, Japan has always been very good with supporting infrastructure development. When you go around Southeast Asia, you see huge projects being undertaken by Japan in Vietnam, even in Myanmar and Thailand, where Japanese have been very good about investing in infrastructure. And so the idea was to take the combination of Australia, which is also quite good at promoting sort of the software side of development in Southeast Asia, and take Japan's capacity to do infrastructure, and then the United States' ability to bring in private capital. And it never really got off the ground for a whole variety of reasons. There was a lack of agreement on how we would proceed with this development finance corporation. There was a slowness in appointing people and figuring out how to actually coordinate the trilateral effort. So we've made attempts, but we've never really been very successful, partly because of lack of interest, I think. And this doesn't start with one administration. This is a gradual lack of interest in really providing foreign assistance. And I think this is something, a fault that people have noted over the decades, that the United States has never been fully committed to true economic development and seeing it through from beginning to end. Some of it is certainly tied to the 4-year cycles that we tend to run our governments on, but it also is just a lack of appreciation for the importance of these countries that are not as integral to our economic well-being as other countries.
Yeah, and our unwillingness to participate, it seems to be emerging even more during the Trump administration. Cutting off USAID is making us enemies, perpetual enemies, all around the world, all around the global South, and people are dying because of that. And I don't think that's good for soft power or
Well,
our
and China, quite frankly, is taking full opportunity to exploit that fact. I mean, they are now portraying themselves as the real benefactor. And I mean, if you watch what's happening in the last week, we have Xi Jinping going to Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, promoting China as the the benefactor and as the center of developing a resistance to what's happening with the American withdrawal from this global system of development assistance.
well, he's really taking advantage, and it's a great opportunity. You can't blame him. He's doing good in his own way. So the question is, why? You mentioned earlier on that there were common denominators potentially between these various countries in the global South. What are they? Can these guys actually get together? Is Xi Jinping offering them an organization? Some of them are involved in BRICS, I know, and he's probably recruiting others. But what is the common denominator that Xi Jinping can use, or I don't know, Russia? I don't know if Russia really counts, but that some country that wants to have a role in this can use to bring them together, to make an organization of them, to have them do mutual benefit, and to consolidate efforts. Is there is there any system in place aside from what Xi Jinping is doing?
Well, I don't think there's anything really very systematic. I mean, there's pieces, and it tends to be fairly regional, but right now, with the World Trade Organization sort of falling apart based on what the United States and China are doing to each other, it's hard to see how we really get back to some sort of global system of economic relationships outside of the tariffs and the counter tariffs that are being thrown at each other between China and the United States right now. But I think there's elements that are starting to emerge. You have trade agreements in Asia that are still strong. I think the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is centered on ASEAN, the Southeast Asia countries, and include uh, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And then you have the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And those in Asia anyway, those organizations or those trade agreements are starting to become the basis for a new economic relationship. Now, can the global South tap into that? No, but I think that it will become the mechanism that allows the countries that are part of the trade agreements to work with this global South country. But there's always going to be this residual category of peripheral economies that are not fully integrated into the capitalist system. I don't think that's going to stop. There's always going to be the countries that are resource rich but financially poor. I mean, there's always going to be the opportunity for exploitation in countries in Africa as long as they have the lack of good governance. I mean, going back to the whole argument about what the United States was trying to do using community building as the basis for a sustainable economic development system, it's not wrong. It's just that you have to figure out how to actually develop that community, and that's the hard part. China says we're not interested in community building. We're just interested in support from the country. We don't care about how the country itself works. In fact, if you're a dictator, that's fine as long as you don't uh, disagree with us, and as long as you don't work counter to our interests. We can let you do what you want, and we'll give you money to build that stadium in the center of the city, and and name it after yourself. We don't care. So I think that that's sort of the Chinese approach, and that approach isn't sustainable either. It's probably no more sustainable than the American community building approach. And so, to answer your question in a simple way, no, I don't think that there is a system out there, but there's elements of regional cooperative mechanisms that are going to come together. I think you'll see the same thing in Europe, that Europe is very much trying to define itself outside of American influence. And this really is for the first time that this is happening. So, I mean, to me, what I see happening is a regionalization, and you're ultimately going to end up with this concert of powers, or at least regional blocs that work with each other. And so, if you listen to China, they've been saying for a long time, Asia for Asians. And I think you'll see the United States more and more get pushed out of the economic trade, or the trade mechanisms in Asia, as well as the security mechanisms.
No, we're pushing ourselves out of it actually right now. Um, and you mentioned earlier, Carl, that some countries which we considered global south and impoverished, back a few decades ago, are no longer impoverished. They're successful.
Mhm.
And so it changes. Like, anything in the world, the only thing so constant is change itself. And so the result is that some of these countries are going to be more akamai, more prosperous than others.
Mhm.
And over time, there'll be a reorganization of the global South. I mean, imagine, for example, two leaders in two Central African governments who went to school in Oxford together for some reason, and they want to make a deal. They want to create an organization that will do better contracts for the mining of rare earth and the like. They want to serve their people in an enlightened way, and they created kind of an organization among the two of them. And then there's others, and all of a sudden you find that they're more prosperous than their neighbors. And so my question to you here, my last question to you is, um, what's the role of these global South countries going forward? They do have valuable resources. They have population and ostensibly a labor force. They have, in some cases, a strategic geography. Can't they come together and be a force of nature and be a player on the world stage, whether they are dominated, whether they are manipulated or not? If they make up their minds and they get educated about it, isn't there the possibility that they will be serious players? Not all of them, but some of them anyway will be serious players and find a role in the new world order.
Yeah, and I think as you develop these regional power centers, I think it becomes easier for that to happen. So in Africa, I don't know. I mean, what countries? What are the two leaders? Is it the leader of I pick two countries? What, Nigeria?
I'll have to get back to you on that, Carl.
Yeah, I mean, is it Nigeria? Is it Nigeria and Ethiopia? I mean, which two countries, which two leaders are we talking about? But certainly it's possible. And there's a huge amount of dynamism in that part of the world, and it could happen. I see it as very potential. And as you regionalize, it may even become easier to see emerging countries in those regions, because they're more influential in the region itself. So I think, I mean, again, I know Asia, and so I think that there's a real potential for Indonesia to emerge as a very strong leader in Southeast Asia, as a force to be reckoned with.
Is Trump's efforts at imposing tariffs, which is generally the people that I know don't think it's a good idea. Um, but these newly enlightened countries of the global South, how are they affected by his attempts at imposing tariffs? What should the right solution be globally about bringing them up and using tariffs for a positive good? Or will we always be having the kind of experience we're having now?
I don't see how tariffs solve anything. I think right now I think what we're seeing is countries sort of scrambling to figure out how to mitigate the effects of tariff on their economies, and I think that's going to be a pursuit of regional, as I said, regional mechanisms that mitigate the influence of uh, America's consumer economy on those countries. And so, you know, I mean, in some ways, the tariffs may very well push some of these countries to become consumer-oriented economies. Part of the problem is because Americans are so much a consumer society. The United States is so much a consumer society. It's been very easy for everybody to feed off the American consumer. But as you build tariffs, basically you fence off that consumer society, and your alternative is if you're China or if you're Indonesia, you have your own large population that could become much more consumer oriented. Your economy could become much more consumer oriented. So I think that this is one of the effects of the tariffs is you're going to find these countries recognizing that there is value in promoting consumerism in their own country. And because that way you eliminate the need for that American market. And so I think that that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is I think you're see, and we see it already that there's a willingness to work together economically to confront what they see as an abuse by the Americans in promoting these tariffs. And so it will encourage these countries to work together to form uh, economic mechanisms that promote harmony between them as a form of opposition to the United States. The easiest, in my experience, the easiest thing to do is to always respond to a threat, and you get a lot of cohesion when you have a mutually recognized threat. And what I see happening in the rest of the world today is everybody recognizing the threat of tariffs by the United States as a threat. And so I think we'll see a coalescence of countries working to mitigate the effects of that threat of tariff.
Well, if next time around I made you the Secretary of State, what policies would you adopt or recommend to reverse course on the decline that we have been talking about in terms of the American participation with the global South?
I would go back to some of the things I talked about, and one is I would work very hard with my European and Asian allies to develop an economic plan that actually promoted economic integration with the global south. I think that's probably the most important thing that we've struggled with ever since the 2010 national security strategy. As the United States, we've recognized that there's a need to develop an economic relationship with the rest of the world, and that our economic well-being is dependent on that global system. But we have failed to do it. And part of the reason, I think, is because we've failed to educate our own population on how to move into an information age economy. I mean, what's happening now is we're talking about reinventing manufacturing. That's not that's not the answer. What we need to do, I think, is we need to two-pronged effort. Is one, integrate ourselves into the global economy in a meaningful way by development assistance, by promoting economic development in the rest of the world, and two is moving an American workforce that is much more aligned with the information age that we live in, and moving away from the idea that there's any comparative advantage to building manufacturing centers in the United States, which is far too expensive and will be very inflationary if you actually pursue it. So I think that that's what I would broad outline of how I would approach foreign assistance and developing a system that the United States can thrive.
I'm casting about for another term to describe the global South, and I think I've come up with one, Carl. It's a ripe pomegranate.
Okay.
What I mean, they have the resources, they have populations, they have the ability to do agriculture, and if they can harness all that, they can be very prosperous on the world stage. It's only a question of harnessing these resources, and I think they have great possibilities if somebody would attend to that. And I don't think it'll be the U.S., by the way. Anyway, thank you very much, Carl. Let's leave it there. Our special guest, Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum, here on Global Connections, talking about taking a closer look at the Global South. A very interesting discussion. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.